Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Robin Archer, and I'm the director of the Ralph Miliband program here at the London School of Economics. And I want to welcome you all to the first of our series of talks on the theme of reconstruction. The premise of our series this year is the idea that many people think that there might be some significant social and political changes in the wake of the onset of this terrible pandemic that we're all living through. And some people think that it might be sufficiently major change to be parallel to something like what happened in the wake of the Second World War. So what we wanted to do was to sort of start a conversation about what kind of opportunities there might be and what kind of dangers there might be for people who are thinking about those changes, and especially thinking about them from the point of view of a broadly progressive politics. And to start that conversation tonight, we want to explore really the relationship between science and politics and what the effect of the pandemic has been on that. And I'm very pleased to say that I can welcome two particularly well qualified speakers to talk to us tonight. And I'd just like to introduce them both to you. So our first speaker is going to be Laura Spinney. Laura is an author and a science journalist. She studied the natural sciences at Durham University and has had various affiliations since, including recently at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. And she's published no less than 5 books. I don't know how she's managed to do that. Most recently, the widely discussed Pale Rider, which I'm holding up here now, which is a history of the 1918 Spanish flu. If you've followed her writings, you'll know that her long-form journalism covers a wide range of topics, many of them, in fact, dealing with medicine and the history of medicine, and they've appeared in prestigious journals like Nature and The New Scientist, National Geographic, The Economist, The Guardian, and elsewhere besides. So she's particularly well placed, I think, to analyse the current pandemic and to place it in historical context for us. Well, our second speaker is Professor Neil Ferguson. He's an epidemiologist and professor of mathematical biology at Imperial College, where he's also, amongst a whole range of other things that he does, the director of the Centre for Global Infectious Disease Analysis. And he has 2 degrees, a first degree in physics and also a doctorate in theoretical physics, both at Oxford University. And he's gone on to gain, I think really he's gone on to gain an unparalleled reputation for his work on the development of mathematical and statistical modelling dealing with the evolution and transmission of infectious diseases. And I mean, unfortunately, he's had a lot to work on. He's worked on outbreaks around the world, not just here in Britain, foot and mouth disease, but the swine flu outbreak, the MERS outbreak, Ebola, dengue fever, and a range of other things. But here in Britain, many of you may have come across him because he was playing a leading role in advising the government during the period when the current pandemic broke out, and was an important member of the government's Scientific Advisory Committee, a so-called SAGE committee. And his modelling is widely credited with having influenced, or in fact changed, the government's basic policy stance on how to deal with it. So he really has important first-hand experience about the interface between politics and science. So listen, what we're going to do is the speakers are both going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to very briefly ask them a question, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, which you can put into the Q&A, and they'll be fed through. Of course, we won't be able to take every question, but we'll try to take a selection of questions on a range of different topics. But before I turn to my speakers, can I just ask you to sort of metaphorically join me in clapping our speakers and welcoming them to the metaphorical London School of Economics. So a very warm welcome to you both, Laura Spinney and Professor Neil Ferguson. And I turn the floor over now to you, Laura.
Thanks very much, Robin. So Robin asked me to speak to this question in a kind of historical context. So that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to make 3 points, basically, or rather 2 points, and then I'm going to end by raising a question, and I'll explore that a little. So the first point is that pandemics are by their nature deeply political. The second is that science when it's applied to pandemics, can't help being politicized. And the third, which is really more of a question, is that given that pandemics are political, what can we do to improve our response to them? What are the lessons that we can take from history? So the first point, pandemics are by their nature very political. And that starts with the naming of them. So if I can take you back 100 years or so, on the 29th of June, 1918, Martin Salazar, who was the Inspector General of Health for Spain, stood up in front of the Royal Academy of Medicine in Madrid and announced somewhat sheepishly that he knew of no cases of influenza anywhere else in Europe. There had been influenza in America for the best part of 4 months, in European countries such as Britain and France for at least a number of weeks. But he didn't know that, and most people in those countries didn't know that because those countries censored their press. They suppressed that information supposedly to prevent the morale of their populations from sinking. Spain, being neutral in the war, did not censor its press and so covered the first cases that exploded in Madrid starting in May. And that's the reason why almost everybody, including Spaniards, assumed that disease was rolling out from Madrid, and the name, the Spanish flu, stuck and still sticks. It's still the name we give to that pandemic, one of the most murderous in modern times because it killed at least 50 million people in the world. And it's a huge historical injustice because it didn't start in Spain. We don't actually know where it did start. But you see that same political game being played today over this current pandemic. It looks for the moment as if the WHO, the World Health Organization, has succeeded in imposing its rather bland, neutral name, COVID-19, for this disease. But that hasn't stopped America and China from squabbling over whether it should be called the American virus or the Chinese virus. And that looks pretty absurd and petty to those of us looking on. But the politicians know that naming has consequences. It has consequences for trade, for politics, for tourism. And they also know that a few generations from now, when people are alive who didn't live through this, the name may be all they retain of this moment, just as the Spanish flu is all that many people retain of the pandemic that happened 100 years ago. And in fact, one could even argue that the causes of pandemics are political. There are historians who argue that. They look back over the vast sweep of human history and they find that there's a statistical association between pandemics, moments of social crisis where there was great inequality, and moments which happen to coincide often where the world is very connected. And you can see that, for example, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, when both Rome and the Chinese empires were at the peak of their power and extent. The rich were very rich in those empires, the poor were very poor, and the Silk Road routes were doing a thriving trade, bringing luxuries to the rich people in both civilizations. And in 165 CE, the Antonine plagues broke out in Rome. The disease eventually spread to China. Within a decade, it was causing ravages there. And afterwards, you see the decline of both empires. And you see this pattern repeated through history. It was the same with the Justinian plagues in the 6th century. It was the same with the Black Death in the 14th. In 1918, it's no coincidence that that coincided with a war. It was a moment of extreme inequality. And I don't think it's any coincidence that COVID-19 has happened now when we live in societies that are more unequal than they've been since the Second World War. But pandemics have political effects as well. So if we look back at 1918, there's a consensus among historians that the pandemic accelerated the end of the Great War. There's also a minority view, by the way, that it might have influenced who won that war, but that's somewhat controversial. It had an impact on the peace process, notably by destroying the health of the one moderate negotiator there, Woodrow Wilson, the American president. And it had sort of social historical effects. It spurred many countries to create or reorganize their health ministries. a debate that had already been happening prior to the pandemic about socialized medicine now bore fruit. You see the first of those healthcare systems being put in place from the 1920s on. The first one was Russia, 1920. And of course, then eventually the NHS in the UK, 1948. Doctors in these countries become civil servants. Health itself becomes political. Public health becomes a sort of tool for extending political influence. Or you could think about the World Health Organization, not created until 1946, but its antecedents are now coming into shape just after 1918 with the health branch of the League of Nations, or an anti-epidemic bureau that's created in Vienna in 1919. And there are even earlier antecedents in the international sanitary conferences, which were held starting from the middle of the 19th century, 14 of them in total, profoundly political right from the beginning, because they were about how to regulate quarantine internationally in a way that caused minimal interruption to trade. And of course, that continues today with the WHO during this pandemic, which is in some ways an arena where the US and China are fighting out their trade war under the guise of health diplomacy. So the second observation I wanted to make was that science can't help but be politicized in its application to pandemics. And the basic observation here is that scientists are always, almost by definition, working in a context of uncertainty when they're thinking about pandemics and trying to control pandemics. They can't do otherwise, because the pathogen that causes the pandemic is always, by definition, novel. Even in the case of flu, which is the disease that's caused the most pandemics in human history, 15, we estimate, 15 in the last 500 years. Each time flu causes a new pandemic, it's because a new subtype has emerged that's sufficiently different to the ones that are already circulating that nobody alive has any immunity to it. So it's essentially a new pathogen. And so there's a sense in which scientists can only ever be reacting to the last epidemic. They can only be using the information that they gathered then and applying it to the new pathogen, which of course is always going to be a flawed approach, but it's the best that can be done. So you see the World Health Organization, for example, being criticized in 2009 for calling a pandemic too soon. This was the H1N1 supposed swine flu, which was actually a textbook pandemic. It definitely fit the definition, spread around the world, but it only ended up killing maximum of 600,000 people. There are different estimates, but really not much more than a normal seasonal flu kills in the world. When Ebola comes along in West Africa, 2014, the WHO, mindful of being accused of reacting too quickly before, is now accused of reacting too slowly and dragging its feet. And you see this kind of pattern. Today, for example, there was an article in the New York Times, very interesting article, about how the WHO's policy since the beginning of this pandemic, which has been an insistence on keeping borders open, is actually not that supported by the evidence. There's not that much evidence to support that policy. And the suggestion in the article is that the WHO is working according to its institutional memory and responding to previous criticisms again, notably when the international community was criticized for overreacting to an outbreak of plague in India in 1994 and shutting down trade and tourism to an extent that caused very much damage to the affected industries in India, and might not have been necessary because the epidemic was being brought quite well under local control. In an ideal world, the scientists bring the facts to the table, they bring the evidence, they advise, and the politicians shoulder the burden of taking the ethical decisions, they decide. But that never really translates into reality, partly because of the uncertainty in which the scientists have to work, which I just described, and because they themselves don't in any way stand outside society. But also, I think, for the reason that I discussed at the beginning, which is that pandemics, by their definition, tend to coincide with other crises. which means that the politicians have competing priorities. And I'll give you some historical examples of that. In 1918, there was no health ministry in the UK as yet. That was created in 1919. So the burden of managing the epidemic in England, at least, fell on mainly on the local government board, whose chief medical officer was Sir Arthur Newsholme. Now, he was receiving information in the latter part of the spring, early summer of 1918, that the first relatively mild wave of the pandemic that they'd already seen was going to be followed by a much more severe second wave in the autumn. Scientists were predicting that. They'd seen that sort of pattern in previous pandemics, and they thought it was likely again. So over that summer, Newsholme drew up plans for reducing the impact of such a wave, predicted second wave. But then he quietly shelved them a little bit later in the summer because he decided, apparently on his own, that the war effort should take precedence. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic in New York, the health commissioner, Royal S. Copeland, delayed declaring a pandemic for weeks, if not months, even though he knew that the number of cases was growing in the city, probably because he didn't want to put the brakes on the troop transports, the transports carrying troops to Europe, since New York City was the main embarkation point for them. And he knew that Woodrow Wilson, the president, had taken the advice of his generals and ignored the advice of senior military doctors to stop those transports. So the troop transports in the autumn of 1918 leaving New York were amongst the deadliest of the war. And just to give you an example, the Leviathan, one of the biggest ships in the world at the time, which left Hoboken, New Jersey on 29th of September 1918, with 9,000 troops aboard, the disease broke out on the ship just as soon as it left harbor. By the time it reached Brest about a week later in Brittany, there were 2,000 cases aboard, there'd been 90 fatalities, and there were Dante-esque scenes of horror in the ship. So I think that I'll leave Neil to talk about that difficult relationship and how it's negotiated in this current pandemic. And I'll just move on to say that, of course, the strength of science is that it can gather evidence later once the pandemic is past. And so it does drive progress in the long run. And that's the reason why today we have a very sophisticated flu surveillance system across the globe that we didn't have in 1918. It's the reason why we have the means of rapidly diagnosing animal diseases like foot and mouth disease. We didn't have that 20 years ago when there was an outbreak in the UK. And that in turn means that we can control those diseases much better, nip them in the bud, cut them off and cauterize them, if you like, without having to cause too much damage to the livestock industry and do mass culls and things like that. Or you could think about, for example, Ebola, which had a profound effect on the way that we fund and develop vaccine development, and the fruits of which we're seeing now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments have got much more involved since Ebola in the funding of vaccines. It's not just the private sector now. There are plenty of public-private initiatives. And there's also more flexibility to the way that clinical trials are constructed. We have what's called now new pandemic paradigm, where those phases of clinical trials that can be run in parallel without compromising safety and efficacy are, and that accelerates in theory the whole process. And sometimes the scientific lessons also come from history or can be reinforced from history. So, for example, I was really interested to notice that just this year, research has come out both on COVID-19 and on the 1918 flu, both suggesting that quicker, shorter, stricter lockdowns are more effective in the long run. They save more lives and they mean that less damage is done to the economy. So maybe that's the truth of contagious, dangerous respiratory diseases in general, which we can now learn and act on in the future. And then the third and last section of my talk is really the question, given the political nature of pandemics, can we improve our response? What are the lessons we can take from history? And I think the first point to make here is that I think it's really striking how easily we forget pandemics. So in France, where I live, for example, there is, as far as I know, and I have looked, not a single monument to the 1918 flu, but there are 135,000 monuments to the Great War here in France. And, you know, that's not just about war monument furniture. It does actually have an effect on the way we think. So, I mean, I've read endlessly in the newspapers since this pandemic began, and the people who are guilty of this are also doctors, include doctors, saying that this is the worst public health crisis in living memory, which simply isn't true. The 1957 so-called Asian flu pandemic killed, we estimate, between 2 and 4 million people globally. It wasn't any easier there to get the estimates right either. But, you know, we have not quite lost 1 million lives to COVID-19 yet. So because we forget, we condemn ourselves to repeating this kind of cycle, and public health experts talk about it. It's well known, this cycle of panic and complacency. We panic when it happens because we don't realize that actually pandemics happen. They are periodic features of human history, 15 flu pandemics in the last 500 years, as I mentioned. And then we forget as soon as it passes, and we don't take the steps that would protect us against future pandemics. So we keep repeating the cycle. And so I think improving our response starts with improving our memory, understanding that there is this perennial threat called pandemics, and that at this point in time, we are not able to either predict or prevent them, but we can prepare for them. So we need to do that better. In order to preserve and kind of continue this memory, I think that we need some kind of institution that is the receptacle for it, that is a kind of repository for not only the memory, but also the scientific knowledge that we accumulate in between times. I remember in 2013, I went to India to report on the Kumbh Mela, which is the biggest religious gathering in the world, tens of millions of people who gather on the banks of the Ganges. And while I was there, I learned that there is somewhere such a thing as a Kumbh Mela file, which is where all the accumulated wisdom of the Mela officers, the people in charge, is placed. And then this is handed down from generation to generation of Mela officers. And we need, I think, the equivalent for pandemic responses. Governments, of course, have their own public health organizations, national governments that is, they have their pandemic preparedness plans, but governments are short-lived. So this institute that is the repository of this memory and this knowledge, I think, needs to stand outside the nation. And it also, I think, very importantly, because pandemics are global, has to have a global mandate. So we need something like the WHO. WHO may not be perfect, but we need it or its equivalent. And once we've got it, which we have, we need to fund it properly, and we need to engage with it properly, because we need to recognize, again, this is a lesson from history, that it'll never be anything other than political, but that if we fund it properly and if we engage with it properly, we can ensure, to the extent that it's possible, its independence, the diversity of its representation, and the fact that it will stay at the cutting edge of science as far as possible. And the remit of that organization also has to recognize the social, political, and economic roots of pandemics. And it has to come up with a response that is a sort of whole of society response. It has to tackle inequality, for example, which is at the root of pandemics. And finally, I think that within nations, since it is nations that are the kind of fundamental drivers of that pandemic response, inevitably each time, we need the structures that allow politicians, on the one hand, easy access to the best available scientific evidence and experts, while preserving a sort of healthy distance between the two. And I think those structures also, very importantly, have to preserve the openness of scientific debate and recognize the fact that science works very often by outsiders challenging the dogma. And that the people in authority at the moment the pandemic explodes, emerges, might not be the ones that provide the insights that increase our knowledge of that particular pathogen. And so I'll just end with a tiny anecdote, again from 1918, which is that one of the first people in the world in 1918 to realize that the pathogen causing the pandemic was not a bacterium, but a virus, was a young French army doctor called René Dujarric de la Rivière. You've never heard of him, but he was posted on the Western Front at Troyes in Champagne, and he saw a troop of artillery soldiers come through. They never made it to the front because they collapsed with the disease or had to be hospitalized. And he tested his hunch on them and on himself, and was one of the first to provide evidence that the flu was caused by a virus. So yes, the insights that can unlock knowledge to the problem and shape the response may come from the most unexpected quarters at the most unexpected times, and we need to remain alive to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to move straight to our second speaker now, Professor Neil Ferguson.
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk more immediately straight about COVID, though I have actually worked on the past on 1918 pandemic flu, studying the effect of exactly the same measures we're adopting now, namely social distancing, in various US cities. And the US at the time was the forefront of the adoption of public health measures, had a very advanced public health service. And because cities responded at different times to the pandemic, were affected by it and learned from each other, you saw very different patterns emerge across the United States. I'm going to talk about four things briefly. Just the nature of science in a pandemic. Laura's touched on that already. I'll say a little bit about the epidemiology and policy challenges of the current situation we're in as we face what's called, rather poor name, second wave. Very briefly talk about the UK science policy interface, and then a bit finish off about more general observations. So science in a pandemic, and as you can tell from the people dressed up there, I mean, it is challenging and changes very quickly. And the thing, I mean, as Laura said, to bear in mind is the uncertainty is always very high. The data is poor to start with, and uncertainty at the beginning is enormous. You have a new pathogen, and it only reduces gradually. If you're trying to inform policy, though, policymakers need some information. And so you're not in a typical scientific research context. You have to undertake analysis, research, experiments, clinical trials, whatever it is, at a highly accelerated pace. And there is a real risk of the perfect being the enemy of the good there. As Mike Ryan, the Deputy Director of WHO said, and it's better to be timely and 80% right than be late and 100% right. It's also good to have multiple perspectives on any one question rather than a reliance on a single view, and I'll come back to that point. And I should say in this context, expertise and experience counts. I mean, so having worked on pandemics before, having an infectious disease background really does make a difference in terms of interpreting trends and the reliability of different data sources. And one has to be prepared for the fact that it will be a noisy picture which emerges. Not all studies agree, not all scientists agree. So generally, it's good to look at everything. There's something in science called systematic reviews. That's one way of doing it. But there can be a tendency to take a particular position at an early point and then cherry pick whatever views which support that. And the last thing is, if there are, this is Occam's razor, kind of fundamental principle in science, if there are kind of simple explanations for why an epidemic is behaving in a certain way, then they tend to be right. I mean, very complex explanations need considerable justification. A classic example in this case is that we can see a very clear correlation between the imposition of lockdown and the reduction of transmission and therefore the effect on mortality. And some would argue otherwise, but that is the simplest hypothesis. Just maybe to summarize, what were the key scientific inputs into policy in this pandemic? And I'm not talking about just the UK here, I'm talking about globally. I mean, there are really three important things. One is how transmissible something is. and the classic R number, the reproduction number of secondary cases, tells you how quickly something will spread and how many people it'll affect. And here we're talking about something which is more infectious than flu. Basic reproduction number R0 of somewhere between 2.5 and 4. And that led to epidemics doubling every 3 or 4 days. So you have something which is moving very quickly, which from a political perspective poses a huge challenge. Firstly, most politicians don't necessarily understand exponential growth, but it means the epidemic and the consequences of it, the overall mortality will be twice as bad if you delay your action by 3 or 4 days. And that poses real challenges both for science and for policy making. Transmission route is of course important, being spread by respiratory spread as compared with Ebola, mostly through fluid, meant it could be ubiquitously spread in society. Lethality is key. I would stand by these numbers. They've been supported. We estimated back in February that on average in the UK around 1% of infected people might die. 2 or 3% might need hospitalization, and this is very close to what we've seen. Treatments have improved since then, which means that in a second wave that may be half, but still a substantial burden of mortality. And finally, it was a novel virus, so we couldn't expect a significant fraction of the population to already have immunity. And since even if you take a very utilitarian perspective that you don't care about old people's lives, most of us do, but then from that utilitarian perspective, you have faced an epidemic which will overwhelm any health system in the world, which is why universally the world responded the way it did. The final piece of evidence, which is what China provided for us, is that kind of draconian social distancing measures are effective. Where are we now? This is something we produce every week, a map of UK surveillance data of which areas of the country are seeing increases, statistically significant increases in cases. You don't need this map to tell you what's on the media. We're not in the best position right now. But we're seeing what's called the second wave, but it really isn't. It's just the effect, the mechanistic effect of gradual relaxation in the social distancing measures we imposed in March. As we reopen, we allow more contacts and transmission resurges. I'm not going to go through all those pictures. They all say a common story. They're the sort of data streams we analyze every day from the UK surveillance data. But all European countries are seeing a resurgence of transmission. The growth is slower than in March because we are in a new normal. We haven't gone back to usual behavior, and that means contacts are lower, and it's the human contacts between households, which are driving the epidemic everywhere. We also have a lot more testing. So the fact that cases are 10 times, at the same levels as March means nothing. We're actually still at infection levels overall in society about 10-fold lower than the peak of the epidemic. But inevitably hospitalizations, and we're seeing that in the data, and deaths will follow. I've mentioned treatment already. I would just emphasize that, from an epidemiological perspective, our report back in March, which has been highlighted by many, criticized by others, did point this out, that as soon as we did stop lockdown, we would see a resurgence of transmission. And so it is not an unexpected or unpredictable event. That's just a graph from that same report. Also, the important thing to remember is that we're at an early stage of this epidemic. Countries which locked down, imposed dramatic social distancing, minimized death to date. I'm not going to go through all the graphs in this audience, but you can look at the commentary in the Lancet. But it basically shows that if there was no effective lockdown, you wouldn't expect any relationship between deaths after lockdown and deaths before lockdown, because lockdown would have no causal effect. But in fact, what you see is a very strong correlation. Countries which locked down earlier had fewer deaths before lockdown, earlier stage of the epidemic, minimized their deaths overall. But the graph on the right is more significant. If you look for antibodies in populations across Europe, it's hard to find any, except small populations, with more than about 15%, and country averages are around 10% or less. So we have a long way to go in terms of reaching this fabled thing called herd immunity. So the challenge we face is that COVID-19 has been delayed but not stopped, that we're in really the same position largely as we were in March, maybe slower growing, but if we allow cases to grow inexorably, then eventually health systems will be overwhelmed. We currently have an epidemic in the UK. My estimate is probably doubling every 2 to 3 weeks at the moment. And it's tenfold less below its March peak. And so that really gives us about 6 to 8 weeks before we get back into that same sort of situation we were facing in March. Now, hopefully the measures announced so far will have an effect, but we can only take that incremental ramping of policies and wait and see so long. But it fundamentally is a political decision of balancing the economic and social costs of interventions, which won't be a full lockdown. We know more about transmission now, against the health impacts of the epidemic and the health benefits of intervening. Coming to the science policy interface, this is from a Gallup poll conducted in 2018 by the Wellcome Trust globally. It shows that basically the people who have trust in government tend to have trust in science. It also shows that there's more trust in scientists than there is in government, unsurprisingly. But there is a segment of society who neither trust government nor trust science. Just talking about the UK approach to scientific advice, which has learned lessons from previous crises. Laura mentioned the importance of a kind of distance between scientists and politicians, and the fact that you pull in a diversity of views, and that is what the UK system attempts to do, maybe imperfectly. I mean, in many other countries, there have been kind of very much more direct interactions between a few scientists and government. Here it all goes through committees, and numerous number of committees. People have all heard of SAGE, but there's many other committees, Nervtagan, SPIEM, the name lists go on. But fundamentally, the chief scientific advisor, and for health emergencies, the chief medical officer, are the two government appointed, qualified professionals, but are civil servants who are appointed to give advice to ministers. In terms of being an external academic scientist, it's always made clear that our role is not to say what policy should be. I mean, that's and I'll come to that later, a value judgment, but really evaluate what's the potential impact of different policy options, and then for policymakers to judge between them. I should also say we've never been involved, no academic scientists that I know of, been involved in the details of policy, the exact rules which civil servants make up, such as the rule of 6. And I've repeatedly emphasised it, and this is true of decisions leading to lockdown and the modelling leading to lockdown. There have always in the UK been multiple groups looking at the same problem. And only when there is a fairly high degree of consensus are recommendations put forward to SAGE. So that leads to a system with many checks and balances, avoid single individuals, despite what the media might imply, having undue influence, but is perhaps slower moving than in other countries. And let's finish by talking about some observations, and I'm not a political scientist, so these are just observations on the politics of COVID-19. And this is a graph from Wired, which shows the extremes of that politics, but rather concerning extremes of that politics, namely the global growth in belief, or at least interest in conspiracy theories around COVID. So to tackle one issue which often comes up head on, the Swedish experience, it's often said, what's the difference between Sweden and Sweden somehow avoided lockdown? Well, it did avoid lockdown, but the differences are actually commonly overstated. It used much more of a mix of mandatory and voluntary policies to achieve much the same effect. And all these graphs show various metrics, either from opinion poll surveys of behaviour or from digital tracking of people's movements, for instance, comparing the Scandinavian countries. And Denmark and Norway imposed UK-style lockdowns. Sweden did not. And you can see differences, particularly initially, in what you might call the stringency of responses. But they converged very much around April. So there were drastic changes to the behaviour of the Swedish population, which effectively led to drastically reduced contacts between people, and the same effect as in terms of suppressing the epidemic as we see here. I mean, the issue of whether governments should adopt voluntary and mandatory policies is really not one for epidemiologists. We only care about whether interventions are effective. It's really one for behavioural and political scientists. I should also say in all of this, and we're doing quite a lot of work on this at the moment, when you evaluate how well countries did, there are two things which influence that. One is the timing of interventions relative to the stage of the epidemic a country was at. And then secondly, the effectiveness. And countries were affected at different times to different extents. And the UK suffered partly because it is such a globally connected country. Coming to the diversity of scientific views, I mean, this is as Laura pointed out, it is inevitable when data is noisy and not always consistent. And even now, many uncertainties remain, and there are plenty of areas for debate. Most of that debate valid. One of the things I particularly dislike at the moment is the idea that scientific debate around COVID is dichotomous, split into two camps. It's also unfortunate that scientists allow themselves to be categorized as belonging to one of those camps. I would caveat though, I mean, scientists are an enormous group of individuals, and just because you work on chemical engineering does not make you an infectious disease expert. And so input and criticism is more credible if it actually comes from people with domain expertise, infectious disease specialists, and who actually are publishing scientific papers on the topic. If you're mainly publishing commentaries in, for instance, the Spectator, rather than actual scientific papers, then you could expect to be listened to less. Similarly, if you are well-meaning, I would say, economist and wanting to critique the science of COVID, then you do have further to go in terms of building credibility in the area. The last thing I'd say, and I'm very conscious of this always, is confirmation bias, the cognitive bias that you want to kind of reinforce things you already believe in and think are true, therefore selectively filter the evidence in front of you, is a problem for everybody and is a problem for scientists just as well as everybody else in society. Just finally, and these are kind of just some thoughts rather than a coherent argument. Whilst I would say that infectious disease experts, those who've worked on pandemics before, have studied them for their whole careers, hopefully know more about how epidemics progress and what policies might possibly work. I don't think that necessarily gives us any greater right to say what should be done by politicians, by societies, or any particular greater insight in the very difficult challenge of balancing the economic impacts of policies against the health impacts. That is why we elect politicians. But there is a challenge, and we see it in the media today, of scientists' personal views effectively merging with their scientific judgment in how they portray issues in the media. And worse, that kind of risk that political perspective ends up affecting scientific objectivity. So if you start from the perspective that lockdown is wrong, then clearly you're going to search for evidence that somehow the science backing that policy must be wrong as well. Moving away from just the scientific community to the general societal debate around this, there clearly is an element in the current debate in terms of attacking science and scientists, which is principally political. It is not interested fundamentally in evidence. So downplaying the risk, cherry-picking information, blatant disinformation, all the way out to the more bizarre conspiracy theories. And it is unfortunate that, we see both emphasized particularly in the US today, but it's increasingly true in European countries, the UK, Germany, even France and Spain, where scientists and science is being used as a tool in this very polarized debate. Concept of post-truth politics comes in here, and echo chambers, where you can basically just see nothing but views which support your own, in some cases, non-evidence-based view. And in that, there's a lot of resonances with what scientists have experienced in other crises, particularly the climate change crisis at the moment, but also in the anti-vax movement. And indeed, many of the same individuals who are skeptical about those things are also skeptical about the science of COVID. That's maybe a slightly pessimistic view, but just to conclude, I mean, I think it is actually a mixed picture, and there's some reasons to be hopeful. I mean, this epidemic has claimed at least 1 million lives, and probably several times that, given that vital statistics reporting in most of low-income countries is absent. But the global response to COVID-19 has undoubtedly saved many times more lives than the epidemic has yet cost. I mean, 1918, despite the efforts of US cities, we did relatively little to actually stop it, certainly in any sort of effective way. I would also argue that experts have been essential in the response. Science informed that response, and we've learned an enormous amount of about the virus in just 10 months. But against that, I've emphasized the pandemic is at an early stage and has best been delayed so far. We have better treatments for people in hospitals. The death rate may be a little lower, but still poses a major threat. And there's real risks that the economic impact of the measures adopted, this fatigue in the population and among politicians and frankly among scientists, is going to make responding in the next few months much harder than arguably it was even in March. Against that, we do understand transmission better and are improving in our judgment around what particular types of measures in a more nuanced way can effectively maintain control of this epidemic while allowing more activities, the new normal, to carry on. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you both for those contributions. As I said at the beginning, I'm just going to ask each of you one question first, and then we'll turn it over to questions that have come from our audience. Can I just address you first of all, Laura? I mean, you made a very interesting point in the sort of last third of your talk, where you spoke about how it's a quintessentially global problem, but the agents for dealing with it are national and state-based agents. And you said that there needed to be some broadly international or global body to deal with that. I wonder if you could reflect on that in a sort of historical sense, looking back over a century or maybe even more. I mean, people who discuss trade policy often say there was a rise in international cooperation over a period of time, and we're now living through a period of declining international cooperation. Is there a pattern or a cycle or something that you can see here in this health cooperation, which is so fundamentally requiring global cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty striking and pretty tragic that this pandemic struck. And again, maybe it's not a coincidence at a time when, I mean, we even have the language, we've been talking about it. The world is more polarized than ever before. Societies are more polarized. And countries, national governments are withdrawing their support and, importantly, their funding from the WHO, which obviously affects its performance. I mean, and I think, that has the support for this international layer has ebbed and flowed across the century, or across the half century since, let's say the century since the first antecedents of the WHO were created after the Spanish flu. Countries have left, countries have come back, and I think it's all symptomatic of this underlying moment of social tension, which then becomes sort of self-perpetuating, because you have the pandemic, you don't have the tools in place, the best tools in place to control it, at least at the international level, and then you see that it itself exacerbates some of the underlying inequalities that perhaps caused it in the first place or made it more likely. And then you can get, uprisings, you can get violence. We have seen an uptick in violence. We saw it before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic is also perpetuating that. I think of Black Lives Matter and matters and some of the violence that has happened in the US lately. So it's really, it's not just easy words when people say a pandemic holds up a mirror to our society. It really does, because it happens because we're divided and polarized. It's harder to control because we're polarized, and it also exacerbates those underlying inequalities and makes them worse.
Thanks a lot. Let me just address you now, Professor Ferguson. But prior to this crisis here in Britain, we were living through a moment which was quite dramatic in terms of Brexit and everything that was surrounding that. It's a bit difficult to remember now, but that was obviously a very important issue and remains an important issue. And in that environment, a political culture emerged in which some people were disparaging about expertise, not necessarily scientific expertise, but other forms of expertise that had a bearing on that debate. And indeed, some of the people that now govern us came to power in part through using that kind of language. And what I wanted to just draw your attention to is, I mean, opinion survey data has always shown that medical experts have amongst the highest trust of experts of any sort. And so I wanted to ask for your observations whether in the wake of the outbreak of the pandemic, has that sort of medical scientific expertise been able to reassert itself, in your estimate, in the public domain? Or is it the case actually that the hostility towards expertise that was there before this happened is gradually, the sort of populist sensibility is gradually affecting even the standing of medical expertise?
I think it slightly depends on which audience you're talking about. I think if you talk about those in power, this pandemic has played out. I mean, I've sat on stage, I think 4 or 5 times in different crises, and this pandemic has played out with much greater consequences, but very similarly to other situations. And for all the criticism of people like Dominic Cummings sitting on stage, I never got a sense that our views were anything but respected and evaluated, in much the same way as Tony Blair's administration back in 2001 evaluated scientific input into foot and mouth disease. I do think some things have changed though. So the scientific community has been a global one for decades. I mean, you use the internet for decades, but the wider effects of social media and the global world we live in has had an effect, I think, on how quickly contrarian views spread within wider society. And in more vulnerable countries, I would say, I mean, the US I would count in this way as a vulnerable country in terms of the nature of its leadership, that has had a negative effect on the policy response. I mean, saw the much faster politicization of the response than most other democracies, for instance. I would also say just something generally, and coming back to the previous question and Laura's comments, that whilst I do think we live in a more fragmented society, both internationally and within our cultures, than we have for many decades, I think the global nature of biomedical research and how quickly information travels. I mean, I had multiple email exchanges, conversations with colleagues in China back in January and February, which cross political divides, is a real positive. We learned more about this virus faster than we have ever done before. And so that just there are some positives in terms of the experience this year.
Thank you both very much. Now we've got a significant number of questions here, and as I did say at the beginning, we want to deal with as many as we can, but of course that won't be anything like the number we've got. But I'm just going to start here with a question for Laura Spinney from Emma, who's in London, who asks, in past epidemics, are there precedents to illustrate whether emergency laws and penalties are more or less successful than softer attempts to influence behaviour?
Yes, although the lockdown that we saw in the spring is pretty much unprecedented on its scale, on its scales, the different lockdowns and strictness. But I guess the accumulated wisdom of trying the different approaches across a number of historical epidemics and pandemics is that you really want to avoid, and this is built into international health regulations and national public health organization strategies, you really want to avoid imposing mandatory restrictions if you possibly can. You want to have people complying voluntarily if you possibly can. There may be some cultural input to that, where, you know, it's truer in some nations than others, and we can discuss, you know, how a Chinese style lockdown would or wouldn't have worked elsewhere. But it is generally true that that your measures work better if people comply voluntarily, and that, of course, has corollaries, which are that your population needs to be properly informed, and they have to trust you. They have to trust your governments, and they have to trust your scientific experts. And if those things aren't in place when the pandemic explodes, then it's too late to put them in place. Trust is something that builds up and that comes down, you know, over long periods of time, and it can't just be put in place like that. So, yeah.
Thanks. So now a question for Neil Ferguson from Shijin Su. By the way, question is, if you say where you're from or what you're doing, it's nice for the rest of our audience because they know who the questioner is a bit more. The question is, it's really about pre-existing immunity. If pre-existing immunity does exist, what percentage of the population do you think already have pre-existing immunity? I should say to questioners that this is a very medical question, but we'll put it anyway and see what our medical experts.
It's a question which has a political context as well, because one of the major arguments by certain minority and propagated also by certain right-wing publications in the UK is somehow a large portion of the hidden portion of the population has immunity to this virus, and therefore projections which said 60% of the population could be infected were exaggerated. So it is a very political question as well as the scientific one. In terms of the actual science, it's an interesting question. So there are different forms of immunity. There's what's called immunity mediated by antibodies, which we get when we get an infection, and we can look for antibodies to see if somebody's been infected. And there's then something what's called T-cell immunity, or really CD8 immunity, which is another arm of what's called the adaptive immune response, but manifests in a different way. And there is some evidence, if you look at the literature, that there is a portion of the population where probably cross-immunity from human coronaviruses has an effect and gives people a certain degree of ability to fight off the virus. I think where the critical disagreement lies is in how that manifests itself. I think it's entirely plausible that, for instance, one of the reasons why some people get basically almost no disease, have asymptomatic infection, but others get very severely infected. What there is no evidence of is this sort of immunity completely protects you, such that you could never be infected, you would never show antibodies. And indeed, there's counterexamples from Manaus in Brazil, in the Amazon, where estimates can now indicate it's one of the areas of Brazil which imposed virtually no controls. And they initially had bodies stacked in the streets, but estimates from serological surveys now suggest over 60% of the population was infected in that epidemic.
Okay, thank you. So question for you, Laura, from David Walter from Birkbeck College here in London. The essence of the question is, if you look historically and compare this pandemic with previous ones, is a big difference, the questioner asks, the presence of big data at present? And more particularly, does the pandemic expose the significance of the cyber society that we're in and the distrust that it, in some cases, appears to give rise to? The question's a bit more elaborate than that, but that's the essence of it. Is this big data cyber society a big difference between now and previous pandemics, in as much as it might foster distrust?
Well, I think that fake news, misinformation has been a problem always in pandemics, but perhaps we have a greater, I think Neil alluded to this earlier, we have greater volume and greater speed because of the internet and because of social media. And so somehow this is not at all scientific, but I have the impression that the volume of information and the volume of misinformation are roughly equal. Maybe there's more misinformation, and it's very often difficult to tell what are the good sources, and they just circulate so fast. So you can be trying to inform yourself, and you just get lost in the data. I think there is a massive problem of information overload and knowing where to look for the right sources. That is separate from the trust issue. There is also a trust issue. But I've also been struck in this pandemic by how very hard it has been, even with our amazing surveillance programs and our medical and scientific knowledge, to, for example, measure the number of deaths. It's just as difficult as far as I can see as in the past. And that has to do with understanding the actual science of the virus and how the virus works in the body, partly. Whether a death from a stroke is in fact a death from COVID-19, for example. These are all things that will take time to sort out. So I think that's one thing that's really struck me, is that just because you have the eyes on the virus, just because you have the data, the means of collecting the data, the means of sharing the data, some fundamental tasks that are essential to understanding, controlling a pandemic are still just as hard as ever.
Thanks very much. So I have a question now from Daniela Frank, an LSE student from Tallahassee in Florida, who's very generously given all the information required of a questioner. And the question is that as studies have progressed and new information becomes available, the public is being asked to follow new directions on how to respond. And the questioner says, rather than people embracing these new insights, this has led to some backlash as people feel they're receiving conflicting information. Do you feel this is an issue stemming from the public's lack of familiarity with science and the scientific method, or are the institutions responsible for communicating the information in some way to blame? And perhaps Professor Ferguson, if you want to comment.
Yes, a very interesting question. I mean, I know Tony Fauci has been criticised in that way in the United States context. I would say that early in a pandemic, we have a very imperfect understanding of what is going on, and that understanding will evolve through time. And so inevitably, messages, policies will change, reflecting that understanding. I think the clearest way of explaining that is just as I've done it. Clearly, if you take, it shows a degree of inconsistency, but it shows inconsistency only in terms of the understanding we have of the science and how that evolves, not a methodological and fundamental inconsistency. And I think that can be communicated. Clearly, there can be those who can point out that, well, you said this then and you said that later. I think it's coming back to the polarization issue. It's much easier, and the trust issue, it's much easier to communicate those changes of understanding in a context where people have a high level of trust in both medical professionals, scientists, and government than in a very polarized situation.
Okay, thank you. So now I have a question from Elif Toka Tunalal at Regent's University. And the question is there any country or region that has the trust of scientists and the trust of politicians today and have been able to handle the voluntary form of behavioural change better than others? Laura, it's sort of, can I turn to you and we'll see if you've got a comment on that?
Well, we're all looking east to the examples of lockdowns that have worked better, apparently, at least from what we can see here, than in the West. That was more or less voluntary, depending on the country you choose to look at. But I think, for example, if you looked at Singapore, and it's important to say it's a small country with a small population, there does, I think, from what I can see there, seem to have been good trust between the authorities and the population. At least a few months ago, regular, communication, great transparency, a sort of whole of government approach where everybody was on the same page. And importantly, I think good trust in the government before the pandemic declared itself, which I've heard Singaporean politicians link back to the experience of SARS 20 years ago. So, you know, yes, I think there are differences between nations in the extent to which they follow the instructions of their governments. And partly that is colored by historical experience, which has not been the same in some Asian countries as here. They had, for example, the example of SARS, which caused by a very related virus. And that taught them some lessons which we bypassed.
Thanks.
Can I just make a comment on that?
Please do, yes.
So I would say there's been no country which has relied entirely on voluntary measures. I mean, it's the extent of the balance between recommendations and mandatory measures which has varied. I mean, absolutely right. Singapore, and I know I work with many people in Singapore, is an example of a country which has had, you know, more. The balance has been more towards voluntary measures, but with a fair degree of stringency associated with them, but also has a very particular culture. I mean, I think some of the more interesting examples are the outliers like Taiwan and New Zealand, where you've actually seen a significant increase in the trust in government throughout this pandemic as compared with a decrease, which has been the common pattern. And a moving from a mandatory approach to a more voluntary approach in both countries, with mandatory elements still in place. In some sense, a reward for success.
And by the way, if I can just add something, in China, apparently, I've been hearing that faith, even pride in the government's response beyond Wuhan and the area that kind of bore the brunt of the lockdown has increased. In Wuhan itself, people are still rather traumatized by what happened to them. So there's been a different response.
So let's just stick with this theme a bit longer and take a slightly different angle on it. There are two questions here that bear on it. One is from Rupert, an MSc student at University College London, who's asking, do you think the relatively low mortality figures from many developing countries, particularly in Africa, are largely to do with poor reporting, or are there other factors at play? And then there's a more general version of this question from Edmund Lee, who's asking, isn't it surprising the comparatively poor results achieved in wealthy developed nations like the UK and the US with ample scientific expertise? What are the challenges for both science and politics that are preventing us from achieving the same sort of results as we've seen in less developed and less wealthy, but also smaller and less politically influential countries? And he cites some of the ones you just mentioned, Taiwan, New Zealand, and a third country which has gone off my screen. Yeah, perhaps Neil, if you just want to say something, and if you do too, Laura, that would be good.
Yes, interesting topics. So to some extent, when you look at what's happened in this epidemic, part of it is down to policy and part of it is down to bad luck. So part of the reason that New Zealand and Taiwan were able to do what they achieved is because they're relatively less connected to the rest of the world than other nations. But a big part of it is responding early and responding hard and imposing the measures they did. I think more generally, remind me of the first part of the question. I was so busy listening to
the first part of the one question was emphasising the apparently better low mortality figures in developing societies, and the second one.
So we are looking at that.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I mean, the centre I run, we still have 30, 40 people working on COVID, and most of them are working in the context of low and middle income countries with governments in those countries. I mentioned very briefly in my talk, I mean, there's very little in the way of vital registration statistics in those countries. And so I would expect, I mean, we know for other diseases, HIV and malaria, for instance, that about 5% of deaths get reported in general in say, for instance, sub-Saharan African countries, which, and so I would expect we're seeing around that same percentage, around, you know, a few percent of the deaths actually get officially reported, partly because of just access to testing. Very few people get tested. That said, there are some structural reasons, lower population density in rural areas, and a very different demographic. I mean, if you have a country where half of your population is under the age of 18, you're going to have lower mortality than for a disease which principally affects those over 75 than a country like Italy, Spain, or the UK.
Yeah, I would just add two things to that. First of all, on Africa, that there was a sort of rumor, I think, at one point recently that Africa had somehow received different strains or forms of the virus than other parts of the world, and that was an explanation for what looked like a relatively mild and relatively late epidemic. And the sequencing information suggests that's not true. It got its virus by hundreds of different importations from all the other parts of the world. So it's got the exact same viruses we've all got. And the explanation must therefore lie elsewhere in the demographics, in structural issues that Neil referred to, and in reporting issues. And the other thing I just wanted to say was that I had the opportunity to interview the health minister of Kerala, the Indian state of Kerala, which has a population of 30 million people. And at least at the beginning, in what we might refer to slightly misleadingly as the first wave, they did really well. And that's obviously a low income country, but it has a really very good primary healthcare network, quite good surveillance. And they put what resources they could into it in terms of manpower. And that meant that the epidemic was, and they started very early, the epidemic was very visible from the beginning. And they also, the thing that she wanted to hammer home when she spoke to me was that they didn't just tell people to go home and leave work and so on. They really focused on the support of those people at home and not able to work. And they brought them meals, or they brought them whatever they were missing because they weren't able to pursue their normal activities. And she really wanted to emphasize that support of people who were having their lives changed and restricted.
Let's make one more general point.
Yeah.
Which is regarding low and middle income countries. I mean, we made this point in a paper in Science some months ago now. The policy options which are feasible in high income countries, I mean, which are a very high income countries, more old people, higher mortality impact, are not necessarily the policy options the whole world should adopt. And we were very clear about that. And we can see that unfolding now. Basically, the whole world locked down in the week following 16th of March. I think not all due to my paper, but it wasn't necessarily the right decision for every country to do. And it's not sustainable. And what you see in a lot of low and middle income countries now is an enormous economic impact, which is a proportion of GDP, and their ability to absorb that impact is far, far worse than we've experienced in high-income countries. And lots of it has been written about supply chains and their vulnerability to these impacts. When we talk about long-term impacts of this pandemic, they're going to be far worse, in my view, in low-income countries than in high-income countries in many ways. Just as in this country, they're far worse in low-income groups and deprived populations than high-income groups.
I won't ask you to answer it, but I'll just draw to the attention of our audience. We have a high school student from India, Vijaya Amritha, who's making the point, sort of contributing to this in a way, and saying the difference between people living in rural areas and urban areas is a very fundamental point that ought to be considered as well. But I won't ask you to comment on that. Can I move to a slightly different topic? John Mason asks, if global governance structures are being made and need to be made in these extraordinary times, above and beyond the normal state apparatus, how do we ensure that such structures remain servants to accountable governments rather than their masters? And I think this gets to a point that many people are, with very different positions, slightly worried about. I mean, it's obvious that there are quite extraordinary restrictions placed on people that would not normally be acceptable. And the authority to make those decisions is something that's a live political issue in the UK and elsewhere. Laura, do you want to comment on that? It was directed at both of you, I should have said at the beginning.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd just say that there's a balance to be struck, isn't there? I mean, there was a story I read today about how certain Asian governments are, have extended some of the quite restrictive measures they put in place to control the pandemic and are now interfering in people's lives to quite an extent. And there are worries about that, perhaps they've used the pandemic as an excuse to extend these powers. And there have been worries about that everywhere from the beginning. So you could see the international layer as a balance to that. I mean, this is, one way of looking at that is the national governments are misbehaving, and the international layer or institution, organization could provide a counterweight to that. But of course, it's all in the negotiation and how you set up that institution, the powers you give it. It can only ever be funded by the nation states anyway, so they have that control over it.
Yeah, and I think if you just wanted to address the same question.
I mean, so I actually think we do have such an organisation, the World Health Organization. I direct the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre. I think WHO has its flaws, but as a UN agency, UN system agency goes, does a good job. I see no appetite politically in the world for member state governments of the World Health Assembly to hand more power to the World Health Organization. So, I mean, I think in some cases that would be a benefit to do so. I think the idea, though, that such an organization may gain power to itself, I think misunderstands how such bodies work. I mean, UN agencies are highly political organizations which balance competing tensions, stresses, funding streams from influential member states, let's say, as we can see unfold today with the tensions between the US and China. And frankly, the fact, and I would actually applaud this government for doing so, the fact the UK has stepped in to make up the funding shortfall for WHO left by the United States.
Just on the more general point, I mean, not about the international bodies, which, as you say, are somehow subordinate to their member states, but national governments everywhere are making extraordinary decisions. And if we look back historically, decisions that are made in times of crisis often do become entrenched. Think about a completely different area. I mean, does anyone remember where income tax comes from? It was because of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, it may now be a good thing to have income tax, but that's why it was there in the first place. So people, I think, do worry about the sort of entrenchment of shifts that are born of crisis. And I just wonder if you would like to comment on how one deals with that worry, I guess.
Well, you can look at the negative sides or you can look at the positive sides. I mean, one of the major worries before we went into this pandemic was that we weren't able to coordinate at an international level in order to tackle climate change. And, there is a category of problem that we cannot tackle without coming together internationally. So, I mean, it's just about the fine detail as far as I can see. We need to negotiate what powers we accord to that body and what we retain in our nation states.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I also think, from a national political perspective, this is somewhat iconoclastic within the kind of individual perspectives of political parties. We have a Conservative government which has, basically intervened with state funding in society on a much larger scale than we've seen since the Second World War, which is not something we might have predicted. And I wonder whether, Corbyn was criticised in the coming up to the election campaign for proposing similar levels of spending, but whether, in some sense, the floodgates have been opened, at least in terms of perspectives and what might be possible.
And that, of course, is something that's very central to the way we're thinking about this whole topic. I have a question here. I think we've got time for one or two more. This is from Peter Hewkin. And he says, if we have adopted a new normal of shutting down economies, travel, education, and so on for a virus like this, should the world now adopt similar protocols for many of our more familiar diseases that could equally well be curtailed by such measures? So I guess that's for you, Professor Ferguson.
So, in all of these things, it's a balance of cost versus benefit. I think the unique thing about the risk posed by COVID was if you do nothing, then you have an overwhelming stress on the healthcare system. It basically falls over, unless you're willing to just let people die at home, which mostly in civilized societies we're not. And therefore, even if you take mortality, deaths out of it, something had to be done. I think there's an interesting question, a scientific question about any lessons we've learned about, infection control in hospitals, in care homes, in other diseases. But I don't think, and we're talking about a different order of magnitude of mortality. Typically 10% of people get infected a year with flu, 1 in 1,000 of them die. And here we have a risk of 60% of people getting infected and a 1% mortality rate. And that is a big difference.
I would just add that there was a brilliant graph I saw which showed that mask wearing, which, by the way, there's now overwhelming evidence that it does cut transmission and it does protect people from infection, despite what some people say, also cut the incidence of a number of quite common infectious diseases. So I think it's really interesting because it does, as it raises the question, are we prepared for the benefits that wearing masks brings outside of pandemics in other infectious diseases to impose that restriction on ourselves all the time? And probably the answer is no in most countries.
And I should say we've seen almost
Yes.
no flu. We've seen almost no flu this year in Southern Hemisphere countries.
That's right. In Melbourne, I believe there were 40 deaths or something instead of hundreds and hundreds as normal. So that's I think we're coming close to the end. There's an interesting question here which I want to put in the first instance to you, Laura. It's from Alex Green, a PhD student here at the London School of Economics. And he says a frequent observation is that countries led by women have fared better than others. And he refers to your minister in Kerala, although of course she wasn't leading the whole country. But I mean, it's clearly true of Taiwan and of New Zealand and other cases. Could that be to do with this growth of trust in these cases that Neil referred to? And what would you comment on that point?
I don't know. I find that really interesting. I mean, I guess we would have to control for some potential confounding factors, like, for example, New Zealand, that are often mentioned, but it's also an island. But it's not always true. And there is an interesting pattern there. I wonder how much it has to do with communication, trust. I hesitate to say caring more about lives than the economy. I think it's more to do with communication and building trust, and perhaps something as simple as TV manner.
And that you've got the big example of Germany, of course, and Angela Merkel. I have nothing to add.
Right. The force of the example is not entirely clear, but it could be understood in different ways.
Well, actually, Angela Merkel did a very good job early in the pandemic of actually explaining the science. She is a scientist. She explained the scientist. I mean, it's more fragmented now in terms of political discourse in Germany, but there was a high level of trust in the German response, and we know about scaling up testing and the rapidity of the German response as well. Whether it's anything to do with gender is another matter entirely.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, though. I think I'll make this the last question. So Kaja Morphew, a public health student in York, has a question. If mixing households is putting healthcare systems at risk of becoming overwhelmed, should we be just following the government advice, or should we be going beyond the current government advice? So here we have a very practical question on which to end. Not exactly the theme. I'll come back to the theme in a minute, but yeah, you are certainly someone in a position to comment on that, Neil.
It's an interesting question. I tend to try to avoid advising people what to do myself. I mean, that is the government. I would say the risks are, you can do relatively little about transmission risks within your own household if you live with other people. I mean, just inevitably, but just being cautious around sensible things around interactions with others. I mean, particularly, way we see social networks structured, we tend to have a kind of core group of friends, people we have close relationships with, and then a wider group of interactions, particularly around the wider group, people you see less frequently, but there are more of them. I mean, use sensible, not restrictions, but be sensible in terms of minimizing infection risk.
Okay, listen, thank you both very much indeed. I mean, we've had some really interesting insights into this question today. From Laura Spinney, we heard about how pandemic can't help, in a sense, being political, but she went on to suggest some ways in which we could learn from the history of attempts to deal with it in the past, and in particular, the importance of having an institutional repository of memory of science, but also just memory of public attitude to these sorts of crises. And from Neil Ferguson, we saw a number of points, both coming out of his work, but also dealing with the UK politics science interface. And he ended, and I think it's a good point for us to end on too, with some reasons to be hopeful. So I hope we've given you some food for thought, some reasons to be hopeful, and I hope you have a safe next week. Thank you both very much to our speakers, and I will metaphorically clap on behalf of all our audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.